The following program is brought to you by the Center for Educational Outreach at Baylor College of Medicine.
Today we're going to talk about inquiry, which is one of the big buzzwords in education in general and in science education. And in fact, it's already becoming one of those endangered terms, meaning that it's overused and there's not a lot of understanding about what it means when we talk about using inquiry to teach students science. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And it really comes back to this very basic question: what is science? It is a way of doing things, right? It is a method. It's an approach. But it's also an approach that is based on questions to learn or know about the world around us. Amazingly, this definition, which is very comfortable for all of you with your science backgrounds to come up with, and it seems very natural, is not something that's natural to most folks outside of science. Usually when we ask a question, what is science? We get something that's, oh, that's the scientific method. And it starts with a hypothesis. And it goes through that long list of procedures that we might, put in an article when we're getting ready to publish. But of course, all of you know, and I know, that sometimes your formal statement of a hypothesis comes way at the end. And at the beginning, you really just have a question about something you want to know. So we're all pretty clear on what is science, even though everyone else might not be. But that brings us to the next point, because what we'd like for our students is for them to be, they may not all be scientists, but we'd like all of our students to be scientifically literate. So how does science literacy differ from science itself? It means that if we have a scientifically literate student or a scientifically literate parent, they're able to view the world with some kind of understanding. They have some understanding of why when we have clouds in the sky, we have a better potential for rain than if we don't have clouds in the sky, for example. We're able to put some of the pieces together, the cause and effect. It also means that students understand that facts are not enough. And this is one of the things that we run into in science all the time in classrooms, that if we memorize a bunch of facts, then we learn some science. And we all know that disjointed facts aren't science at all. So someone who's scientifically literate knows you have to make some connections with your knowledge. And also getting at the point that was just raised, that if we're approaching a problem scientifically, we're thinking about it in a specific way. We're posing questions that could be testable. We're not, asking open-ended, kind of out-of-the-blue questions. We're asking a question that we know we could figure out a way to answer. So again, it's scientific patterns of thought are different. And finally, that we can take information from science and use it to solve real problems in the real world. So these are one of the things, these are learnings that we would hope that our students would have related to inquiry. This is another question that comes up all the time related to inquiry and its role in society. Why do we even need science? And you're going to have students in your classroom who are going to say this, my mom never had any science. She did just fine. She has a good job. Why do I need to take AP chemistry next year? Well, some of the reasons are, one, everything we do relies on science and technology. Most folks out there are not aware of that, the plastic on the countertop, all of the equipment that we're using, the clothing that we're wearing, in one way or another came from science and technology. And that is completely lost in our modern understanding of society. What's also lost is that almost every job today requires some level of technological expertise, even if it's jobs that might not be paying that much. Supermarket scanners rely on lasers and computers. The UPS man just made a delivery on this floor and he had a handheld computer. So everything we do now requires some knowledge of science and technology. And finally, this is probably the most important for all of us, that science helps us make informed decisions in everyday life. I certainly hope that kids who are students today will be able to make good choices when they as voters have to vote about the environment, about restricting maybe greenhouse gas emissions, about making decisions about the healthcare system in the United States. These are all important issues, and people tend to make different choices if they know the science behind an issue. So these are all reasons that you can give to your students when they ask you, why do I need this stuff? We know also that the way we're teaching science now, which is primarily not teaching science through inquiry, doesn't meet students' needs. The information, some of you have probably seen this already, it's pretty scary. Most U.S. high school students can't apply any science knowledge to solve a problem. Design a simple experiment, and we're just talking about something that has a control and an experimental group. Or explain their reasoning behind an explanation that they might have gotten or arrived at for a science experiment. Internationally, our students are testing well below all other students internationally. In elementary school, our kids test great. In fact, international science test scores of American students are close to the top. Now, this should make us feel really good. The problem is most other countries don't even teach science in elementary school. So that's not a fair comparison. By middle school, our students fall to the middle internationally, and by high school, we're at the bottom. And what I find most distressing of all is that I think all of us would agree that AP physics students would be considered some of our, advanced placement physics students would be considered some of our better science students. When they're compared against physics students of comparable levels in other countries, they're at the bottom. This is also a huge worry, that within our own populations, kids who are considered at risk, and usually they identify them as at-risk students as those who qualify for federal free and reduced lunch, achieve at lower levels on just about every subject across the board. So this is a huge concern to narrow the achievement gap between some of these groups. So one of the attempts to change the way we're doing science in the United States came from the National Science Education Standards, which are based on these principles that all kids do need to learn science, not just the few who want to have a research career. But that in order to learn science well, we have to do science, because this came out in our earliest discussion this afternoon. Science is both a way of doing something and a way that we view the world and acquire and think about knowledge. That if we're going to do science in school, it needs to look like modern science. And finally, that we have to embed what we do in science with educational reform in the big picture. In other words, we can't just go in and try to pick out science and work on that and not work on the big picture. The science standards took almost 4 years to develop. So we do have a lot of faith in what they recommend to us. And it involved a lot of scientists out of the National Academy of Sciences, as well as science educators, as well as classroom teachers. So it was a document that really does have a lot of validity. And most of us working in science education today are basing what we do, benchmarking to the National Science Education Standards. The nice thing about the standards is, and something that you can keep in mind when you're back in a school is, the science standards don't look only at what students should know and be able to do. They also look at what good science is in a classroom, what appropriate science teaching is, how do we provide professional development for teachers, what do school-wide science programs that are good look like. So it gives you standards across the whole spectrum of what is science education that at some point in your career may be very useful. If you're able to participate in planning for professional development for other science teachers at your schools, you can base your decision on perhaps what the recommendations are in the science standards for professional development. So this is what science used to look like, still does look like in a lot of places. This is how I learned science throughout much of my school career. It may look familiar to some of you. Kids read aloud from texts. In fact, Sonia and I were in a classroom here in Houston not long ago where the students were taking turns reading paragraphs from the biology book. Students memorize long lists that may not have much meaning to them. The content is presented in a lecture, and I apologize for presenting content in a lecture now. You have to remember verbatim what you read or what was on the list. Your lab experiences merely confirm what you heard in lecture yesterday. And this is the classic undergraduate teaching mode. You go to lecture one day, they tell you everything you need to know, and the next day you do a lab just to confirm what you heard in lecture. So there's no open-ended aspect to what you're doing. You're following the cookbook through the recipe to get an answer that you already know. And finally, the only goal of assessment traditionally is to give the student a grade. And there are many other uses of assessment that we'll also be looking at. We hope to change all of this and move from fewer lectures to more investigation of questions, to move away from students working alone to students working in groups to solve a real question, to move away from knowing facts to understanding big picture concepts. And there's a growing body of research that shows that it's better to teach a student one big idea, even if they might not get to explore the other big ideas in depth. It's better to understand one big system well than to skim across the top and acquire superficial understanding of a lot of small concepts. Because if you understand one big system well, you've got something to link information to, and you've got a model that you can build on. In fact, our science curriculum has been described as Bill Schmidt, who actually was the director of the analysis of the TIMSS data, as a mile wide and an inch deep. You know, we try to cover everything, and we don't cover anything in a substantial way. We'd like to move away from short investigations that are a class period or less to something that students would do over a period of weeks as their understanding continues to grow. To again go away from the cookbook science, to get to do some real science, to change the focus from just getting an answer, to be able to interpret evidence to find your own unique answer, and to be able to defend your answer using the evidence that you yourself collected. To assess understanding. And finally, this is requiring a huge change in the role of the teacher. And you're going to see this in the schools. And I think all of us have experienced this. Traditionally, the teacher stands in the front of the class. They rule the classroom. They're the technician. They know all the stuff. What we hope to see is a shift so that the teacher is the facilitator on the side, letting the students gather their own information. And inquiry can mean different things depending on how you're using the word inquiry, depending on the context in which you're using it. So inquiry can be an understanding of how we do science, which is, you know, the process that you all just went through in the past 15 minutes or so with this little exercise. It can also be the set of skills that you applied to go through the exercise. So it's being able to formulate, for example, a testable question, or to use evidence to justify your hypothesis or prediction. And finally, it's a way to teach as well. It's an instructional approach. It's an approach that lets students investigate real questions. And we'll talk about that, what it looks like in the classroom, a little bit more for you. So first, again, inquiry, first of all, is an understanding of how science works. And there are some basic assumptions about science. One, that we're asking a question, but that the kinds of questions that we ask in science are special, right? And I've given you examples of two questions here that are not scientific, right? Which toothpaste is best? You know, how could we test that? Or, you know, what is the meaning of life? It's not a scientific question. It's a question for philosophers, but it doesn't fall within the realm of science. But the scientists also use a variety of approaches, and this is something that is completely lost so often in school science. And I think it even happens to those of us who are very engaged in our own research question. We think everyone does science the way we do. And in reality, astronomers do science very differently from the folks over here in the DNA sequencing center. They're asking different kinds of questions. Astronomers are not able to perform experiments. They can observe relationships, movements, maybe even cause and effect. but they can't do experiments. But what they do, I think we would all agree, is still science. So there is science that sometimes is descriptive or based on observations. There is some science that is experimental, and there's science that's comparative. A lot of ecologists have to look at two different ecosystems. Again, they can't do experiments on the ecosystems, but they can compare them. And of course, important to all of this is, again, this underlying assumption that there are patterns and that usually there are cause and effect relationships. And that the explanations we arrive at in science, again, are based on evidence. And this is so critical. What they find is in schools that kids can't use evidence to justify their answers. It's a great problem-solving skill for students to have. So that's the first interpretation of inquiry, that it's an understanding of what the elements of science are. But yeah, so the math and technology is the other piece. So if we think about what inquiry might look like in high school, and this comes exactly back to the question we were talking about just a moment ago. So what should kids in high school be able to do in terms of inquiry, or what might you be able to expect your students to be able to do? Again, identify a testable question, and that could guide their investigation. Design and conduct a simple investigation, one, maybe two variables. Use technology and math, either in their technology may be part of the observations, but technology and math may be part of the interpretation of their evidence. And graphing is a critical skill here as well. You will find that there will be a huge range of abilities of your students to create and interpret graphs of data. And it's a critical skill for them, not only in terms of a life skill, but in terms of passing tests. So and science is the perfect place for them to acquire these skills. And finally, for them, along with the tentative nature of science, they should also recognize that there can be alternative explanations. And finally, you would expect your students to be able to defend a scientific argument. So inquiry is also a way that you can use, is approach you can use to your teaching, which means a lot of things. There's a whole range of teaching strategies that are encompassed by inquiry. Pure inquiry means that the kids got excited about something and they came up with their own question, which is wonderful. But sometimes they come up with questions that are completely outside of the curriculum, and you will be guided also and have the need to have the students move through a certain set of learning objectives. So sometimes you will find that an open-ended student-generated question is not the best way to go. It might be for a science fair project or a special end-of-year project. It might be that they're going to investigate a question that you pose. It can be a situation where the students collect their own data, or it can be a situation where they're given the data. Again, given the constraints of the classroom, sometimes it's feasible and sometimes it's not. So again, there's a lot of leeway in where the data comes from. But in all cases, the students use evidence to construct their explanation. But it may be with guidance from you. You may even be giving them, if it's the beginning of the year and they've never done this before, you may be even giving them a worksheet with prompts that they need to use to work their way through. But maybe by the end of the year, you'll have them where they can construct the explanation by themselves. And finally, you're going to hope that they can communicate what they found. And again, this may be using a pretty rigid structure that you've given them, particularly if they're just learning, or it may be something that's very open-ended that they devise. So you can go all the way from something that's pretty structured to something that's very open-ended. And that's where your judgment as a teacher on where your students are will really come into play. Usually towards the beginning of the year, there's more structure and you're posing the questions. And as you move towards the end of the year and the students are more comfortable with the process, they begin to pose their own. And sometimes it's just great to get off track. If you're in the middle of something and someone comes up with a really fabulous question, and you sense that it would really help the class as a group, be brave enough to go after it. Because nothing is more important to students than investigating their own question. So sometimes if you can find a way to make it happen and they have burning curiosity about something, let them go after it. There are several instructional models that you can use also that will help you promote inquiry learning in your students. And these are 3 of them, but they all follow the same general pattern. First, you engage the students. And for example, an engage type activity that we did today was when I asked you to talk about what you thought the elements of science were when we first started the session from your perspective. It serves 2 purposes. It kind of gets you thinking about some of the things that we're going to be learning, but it also lets me know as a teacher where you are in your understanding of the concept. So it serves 2 purposes. 1, to get the students interested, and 2, to inform me as a teacher. The next step is the actual doing of the experiment. And actually, I'm going to take you through one of the models. So the first step is engage. So when I asked the question, we bounced it around a little bit. That was the engage. And really, the most critical piece of the engage phase is figuring out where the students are. The next part is explore, where everyone has an opportunity for creative thinking, testing predictions. But then we have to explain. We just don't stop with explore. And this is something that you will see a lot in classrooms. That there and it particularly happens in elementary school, there'll be this huge focus only on the explore phase. We're just going to do something for the sake of doing. And we're never going to come to any of the other steps, like explaining and thinking about what we learned, how it relates to other learning that we have, what line of evidence, again, can we use to further our thinking to arrive at a conclusion. So exploring is not enough. We have to come to explaining, and hopefully also to elaborating. So elaborate. So you would apply the concepts to a new situation. And finally, we evaluate. But evaluation is a 2-way street again. It's what does the student know, but it's also an evaluation of how did the teaching go. And this is, we often, everything is so grade focused, performance focused, but if everybody in the class gets it wrong, that's an evaluation for me as the teacher. And it means that I need to go back tomorrow and figure out another way, because obviously I didn't get the message across. So that, the students are giving me important information that I can use in my own teaching. So especially when we're talking about inquiry, we want to use assessment as a 2-way street for the student and for the teacher. And let's see, we've got just a couple more minutes. I've got something brief for each.